In Module 3, we talked about some different types of biblical criticisms, and so I wanted to, for this section today, this week on Module 4, I wanted to take a couple of the letters of Paul and work on those and just kind of explain, maybe use one of those types of criticism to give you an example of how it might help you in your study of the New Testament and, of course, in your teaching as well. So I want to take the example from Corinthians and talk a little bit about how historical criticism can help enlighten a little bit of our understanding of the letter. So if you think about Corinth, some basic facts about the city of Corinth, if you do a little bit of background research. Corinth is located on an isthmus that connects the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the mainland of Greece. But there really were two different histories of Corinth, because there was a Greek Corinth and then a Roman Corinth. The Greek Corinth was the Romans destroyed Corinth in 146 BC, and they razed it to the ground and then rebuilt it only at 44 BC. So basically, Corinth lay in ruins for 100 years, then was rebuilt just before the time of the apostles of Paul. And so when it was rebuilt as a Roman colony. In fact, excavations of Corinth from the time of the apostles, the things they've found 104 inscriptions on different tablets or signs and things like that they've uncovered. 101 of those were in Latin, and only 3 of them were in Greek. So it really speaks to the Roman character of the city as opposed to the Greek character that you might expect because it was on the Greek peninsula. When you think about the geography of Corinth, there were 2 ports, the port of Lycaeum, which is on the Adriatic coast, and then on the other side of the isthmus was Cenchreae, and that one was on the Aegean Sea. And so most trade traffic that would go out of Rome and out of Italy would come across the Adriatic Sea. They would port at Lycaeum. Then they would take all of their goods off the boat. They would transport them the short distance across the isthmus to the other side, to the other port at Cenchreae, reload ships that would then be sent to all points east from there. And so because of that, Corinth was an extremely wealthy city. You've got 2 ports. You have all the taxation that would come from passing goods from one area to another. Certainly, as in modern times, ancient times, port cities had a very lascivious nature to them, of course, and so a lot of the things that we might expect about a port city we would see in Corinth. There are actually, interestingly enough, with Corinth, there's 2 different historians or geographers that write about Corinth. Strabo writes in his geography, describes Corinth, and the glimpse that he gives us of Corinth is about 50 years before Paul comes. And so it's a pretty good estimation of what was going on at the time of Paul. Pausanias, another historian or geographer, gives a very detailed description of the mid-2nd century Corinth. However, I think it's important to note that there was a major earthquake between the time of Paul and the time of Pausanias. And so the descriptions that Pausanias gives us roughly 100 years after are going to be a little bit skewed in the sense that I'm sure many things were changed and rebuilt following the earthquake. In the middle of the city, as described by both, and particularly by Strabo, there's an Acrocorinth, is what they called it. It's a mountain, the mountain that rises in the middle of the city. And there was a road that led up to the peak of that mountain, and it was lined with sanctuaries to various gods. It would line either side of the street. The temple of Aphrodite was at the summit. Now, Strabo, the one that's probably most likely to have given us an accurate picture of Paul's Corinth, describes the temple of Aphrodite as being quite small. Now, he also says that there were 1,000 prostitutes that served at the temple of Aphrodite. Most scholars think that he's relying upon information that was describing Greek Corinth rather than Roman Corinth. but it's possible that he's mixing sources there. And so anyway, maybe we've heard those stories. I mean, certainly there was a temple of Aphrodite at the top of the road, but it was quite small during Paul's time. Also, another important feature of Corinth was what they called the Isthmian Games. I can't really pronounce that very well, but on the Isthmus, the games, a type of Olympics. These would have been held not far from Corinth. And of course, we know that Paul uses allusions to that in his letters, talking about using sports analogies, essentially. People there would have understood that very well. There are a few cultural points of contact historically with the letters themselves to the Corinthians. Certainly one of those would be the whole meat sacrifice to idols debate. Christians would have come in contact with meat sacrificed to idols in two different ways. Either they purchased meat from the marketplace, because usually the meat sold in the marketplace were meats that had been retrieved from sacrifices that were made at pagan temples. So they would offer a sacrifice a bull or what have you. They would cut up the meat. Much of it would not be used in the sacrifice, and it would be resold on the open market. And so much of the meat you would buy in those days would have been sacrificed at some temple or another. And so that would have been one way that Christians might have come in contact with meat sacrificed to idols. The other way would have been just attending a pagan feast in general. Now you say, well, why would they do that? Many of these temples were not temples as we would understand them, as just simply places of worship. They were, many of them described by Strabo, they were equipped with large dining rooms. There were numerous accounts of temples that had anywhere from 3 to 52 different dining rooms. It was kind of more like a sanatorium. So you would go there, you would relax, you would socialize, you would eat. There was abundant water supply there, so people would go there in many ways to seek healing and just to relax. And so it was in some ways, they were the center of social life in Corinth. So that helps to understand that, just even as you think about some of the scriptures that talk about meat sacrificed to idols. There are other connections with background material. For instance, the hair debate. If you go and read 1 Corinthians 11, talking about long hair for men or short hair for women, that sort of thing. It's kind of ambiguous. Paul's discussion is ambiguous. However, interestingly enough, there is a dialogue between Epictetus and a young rhetorician who according to him, had, and I quote, elaborately ornamented hair. And it really is, we kind of glean from that. Some of the things he says are some of the same things Paul says. And from that, we understand that for that time, during that day, that sexual identity, hair was a sign of sexual identity. And so certainly there was an understanding, I guess, in the time that for men to have long hair, that was effeminate. And so even the satirist Juvenal, writing in much the same time period, refers to the scented or effeminate Corinthians and calls them long-haired catamites or homosexuals. And so, so there's this understanding. And so I think that Paul, as he addresses that, however you decide to decipher that passage and what his main point is, he's referring to this debate or this understanding that was going on in Corinth at the time. Another kind of interesting point of contact historically is in the letter of Romans. There is Paul writes from Corinth, and he's with a guy named Erastus. Mentions Erastus, who was the director of public works, which is really interesting. They found a plaque in ancient Corinth, there where they've uncovered and done some archaeology. They found a plaque that basically has his name on it, where he basically donated an area of this, I guess a part of the road or something in the city, and donated it. And so, assuming that's the same guy, we get a pretty good understanding of just some of the types of people that were actually baptized in Corinth. So we had some pretty wealthy, very connected folks in the church in Corinth, which actually, again, as you read the text, you begin to kind of glean some of those types of things from what you read. So as you think about the basic overview of Corinthians, I'll just hit a couple things quickly, and then we'll talk on another video about some of the other books. But Certainly there were a lot of problems with overenthusiasm. They were very much impressed by spiritual gifts. We know that from chapter 1, 5 through 11, 5 through 7. They were less concerned with understanding these powers than with using them. And so they were fascinated by the spectacular. There's a spiritual elitism had infected the church, and they considered themselves to be fully mature and perfect already. We learned this from chapter 2 through verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 4. They tended to judge each other, even their mentors, and while at the same time neglecting the moral demands of their calling. And so the tendencies seem to have a root in an understanding of resurrection that stressed its present power, but denied its completion in the future life. And so there seems to be this spiritual elitism that leads to factionalism and really a tendency to define themselves more by their differences rather than by their common life. We know that there are 2, of course, letters to the Corinthians, and there were probably as many as 5 that were written, but only 2 of them remain today. 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9 refers to an earlier writing. Some believe that maybe 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14 through 17 was a piece of that former letter. I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can read about that. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1 refers to a letter full of questions that were written to Paul. We don't have that. And so it's written in response to those inquiries. Then 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 4 mentions a letter in tears, though a letter where Paul writes in tears, and that one appears to now be lost. Although some people, if you read 2 Corinthians, it's kind of weird because Paul's seems to be very happy and pretty excited through most of the first half of the book, and then suddenly the tone changes and he seems very distressed in chapters 10 through 13. And so some people like to say that, well, perhaps those chapters 10 through 13 were actually a piece of that other letter that's lost, and they just somebody at some point in time tacked it on to the end of 2 Corinthians. I don't know about that. It's tough to make those kind of arguments, but nonetheless, it is very clear. There's a very clear change of tone in the letter. And so some think that perhaps 2 Corinthians might have been edited or as a composite of several letters of Paul. So that gives you just a little quick background on Corinthians and gives you an example of maybe some ways in which historical criticism can offer a little bit of insight into what we're reading, and perhaps even help us to find some things for ourselves and some teaching points as we approach these letters.